Okay, off we go. Okay, so what I want to do today is firstly to dedicate tonight's shir to Lionel's late father, Moshe Chaim ben Abba Shraga, whose Yortzeit is tonight. So please God, in the merit of the Torah that we learn, and not only the Torah we learn, but the Torah we put into practice, because that's really what it's about. It's not just simple learning, but the Torah we put into practice. Please God, his neshama should have a continued aliyah. And every time I was speaking to somebody today about this. Every time we sometimes don't realize, but every time that we do something that we've learned about and was done, the learning was done in the merit of somebody. So every time we do that, that has an impact on the elevation of their neshama. So please God, as we warm our food on Shabbos, and we'll see what it's all about, then we'll know, and your dad's memory will just be pervading and in all of that. So just have lots of comfort from that. Okay, so let's get going, because there's that we've learned, the learning was done in the merit of somebody. So there's always a lot to do when it comes to Shabbos, and when it comes to Bishul really is perhaps one of the most complicated parts of Shabbos, because it's so intricate in things, and there's so many layers. So let's start. Last week, I'll share my screen quickly. Last week we just gave some introductions to some of the different halachas in Shabbos. If you remember, the one of the things we spoke about was some basic Doraita principles. Yad Soledet War, which was the temperature, Machal Ben Drosai, which is the minimum amount of cooked that a food has to be. It's about 1/3. We spoke about Ein Bishul Achar Bishul, that there's no cooking after cooking, which means that once you've cooked something, you can't recook it on a halachic level, but we'll understand and we'll unpack that a little bit more. Then we spoke about Kli Rishon, Iri Kli Rishon, the different type of kalim, and Hagasa is mixing. Now, all of these keep coming in because they're all part of the same milieu. So as we go through today, we'll be mentioning a couple of these concepts, but now since we've gone through them, I'm not going to go through them in detail because we understand them from last week's shir. If there are any questions on those, please let me know after the shir. Okay, so let's start out. The first thing, there's a Mishnah in Shabbos, and the Mishnah says, "Kol sheba b'chamin me'erev Shabbos, shari nosoi b'chamin b'Shabbos." That anything that has gone through hot water, i.e., it was cooked before Shabbos, then what happens is that what shari nosoi b'chamin b'Shabbos, you can put it into hot water on Shabbos again. So that already you can see that there's this concept of allowing something which has been cooked to be kind of like recooked or warmed up, and we spoke about that quite at length when we did some other stuff a few weeks ago around can you warm up your spaghetti bolognese. That's not really what I'm looking at. I'm not looking about warming. I'm looking at something a little bit more technical. But if you haven't put something into hot water on Erev Shabbos, you can put it into hot water on Shabbos, but you can't soak it in, except for chutz min hamaliach hayashan, except for old salted fish, v'dagim maluchim, and these small little salted fish, and the Kolias ispenin, there's some strange fish as well. Why? Because when you put those things into hot water, you complete the cooking process of those things. They're kind of like 3/4 cooked, and the minute you put them into hot water, so then the hot water itself completes the cooking process. And since it completes the cooking process, that's problematic. So immediately we see some which is cooked, looks like we can kind of do something to warm it up again. If it was in hot water, it can be done in hot water. So it seems to be, it has to be the same thing. But something which is not completely cooked, if you would put it into heat, then that heat would cook it and complete the cooking process. So then that becomes problematic. Okay, so that's one part. Then we have this other idea of of Beit Shammai says, well, you can remove a pot from the stove on Shabbos, but you can't return it. And Beit Hillel say you can return it. So this is a big machlokes of what's called shehiyah. Shehiyah means you leave it on Erev Shabbos, and then you take it off, and then you have to do what's called chazorah, to return it back. And there's a big machlokes between Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai whether you can return it. On a simple level, what they're talking about when it's still hot is that you take it off like you want your cholent. You want to keep your cholent hot because you're going to have cholent now, and somebody's going to come a little bit later for lunch. So you take the cholent out of the cholent pot. Can you put it back onto the cholent pot in order for it to remain, for it to continue to be warm? So it's not as simple as we'd like it to be, and that will go really into the detail of when we get into the halachas of chazorah and shehiyah, because those are more derabbanans. But what we do see is that according to Beit Hillel, if you can even return it, it's clear that one of the things that happens when you return it is that it gets cooked. So what about, how can you cook? Well, because there's Bishul and Bishul achar Bishul. It's already cooked. So the issue is not the cooking part of it, but the issue is something else. It's meisik and mavasha. It looks like you're cooking it. There's a whole lot of different things which we're going to get to when we get to those in the thing. So we all know that there's this concept of can you warm up a liquid on Shabbos that's already been cooked? So is there a difference between a liquid and a solid in this concept of Bishul achar Bishul? So Rashi, Rabbeinu Yonah say there is Bishul achar Bishul belach. Lach means something which has a liquid. And they understand that from the halachas of Hatmana. Hatmana is insulating foods which are already cooked. They have a whole discussion about that, because Hatmana really means that if you're going to insulate something in a davar shemoisif hevel, something which will add heat to that which you're putting it into, and thereby improve or recook the food, so that's problematic. You're not allowed to do that on Shabbos, and that again is another thing we have to look at. There's Hatmana, Shehiyah, Chazorah. All of these are different halachas that we have to go into. On Shabbos, they're all the Rabbanans, but all of those indicate that there's a certain reticence of Chazal to allow liquid to become warmed up. Because according to Rashi and Rabbeinu Yonah, you definitely can't warm up liquid. But the Rosh says the following. He says that Rashi's view is yesh bishul achar bishul, right? When it comes to liquid that has cooled off, Rashi says it's a decree because we're worried that he'll heat up a pot that has cooled down. So therefore, it's simply a gezerah, right? What that means, it's become like a custom that we don't do it, and that's really the big issue that we're going to look at. There's a lot of discussion here. I don't want to go into the too technical form, so I'm going to go to the next thing. There are other Rishonim. So you've got to remember the Rishonim are these great medieval sages. There's Rashi, the Rambam, Rabbeinu Yonah, Ramban, Ibn Ezra, all the people you hear about are the Mefarshim on the Torah. Yeah, all these people are the great Rishonim, and those are the people that really determine how we go with halacha. And the Shulchan Aruch, which is like the last of the Rishonim, who crosses over into the Achronim, which are the latter sages, that the Shulchan Aruch, which is the Beis Yosef, of Yosef Karo, he'll take the Rishonim's opinions and put them into normative halacha. So most of the other Rishonim say there's never bishul achar bishul. You can't cook after you've cooked. Cooking is once it's cooked, it's cooked. Remember, part of the concept of cooking is that the heat changes the nature of that which you're cooking. So therefore, once it's cooked, which you can understand on certain liquids that Rashi had a certain reticence, because with the liquids, once water, for example, is no longer hot, it goes back to its original state. It doesn't change. Although I'll tell you something interesting. What is interesting is that when I used to help Rabbi Maisels with kashering in Cape Town, he pointed out to me something fascinating, and that is that if when you're kashering, you're using these big barrels of water, and the water has to boil to a point. If you're going to kasher this, by the way, it's an important thing to know. It's coming Pesach, we'll have a special thing on kashering for Pesach, but the water has to be boiling. Rotchim. So you have to see the bubbles. The bubbles have to be there. But what he pointed out to me is that after a certain period of boiling, it doesn't bubble so much because there's not, it boils out the like active oxygen in the water to the extent that, as way he explains, is the water's dead. It kills the water. That's why the minute you add more water and it starts boiling again in a proper and powerful way. So there is, even in water, you can see that there is a certain level of change that comes from the boiling process. Okay, so now let's get out down into the nuts and bolts. So what I'm really going to do is use the use the Shulchan Aruch for these discussions, because, as I said, it's very complicated, and let's just go through using the Shulchan Aruch and going through. I'm going to read it in the Hebrew and translate it as we go along, and feel free to follow with me, or you can read it in English. So, Tavshil, bashal kol tzorcha, a food which is fully cooked. Yesh bo mishum bishul im nitztanein. Says the Shulchan Aruch that a food which is fully cooked, if it gets cold, you can't reheat it because there's the malach of bishul. In other words, the concept of cooking, which is a doraisa din, sits in a thing that has become cooled down. Says the Ramah, Haggah, wherever it says Haggah is the Ramah. The Ramah, Rav Moshe Isserles, he says, now, some say this is dafka in what? In a food that is mitstamek v'yafelo. That if the food is heated, and the heating process mitstamek v'yafelo makes it better, makes it nicer, so then you can't reheat it. And if it is not cooked, it's fully, but it is cooked even to the point of machal ben drusai, which, remember, we said is about a third. Shayach boy bishul. Bishul still applies to this thing. Even if it's still boiling hot. In other words, you've got food that is boiling hot, you take it off the stove, you can't put it back on under basic principles. You can't put it back on because that would be considered to be bishul. Because why? Because you're completing the bishul process. V'hani mili, he says there, this is this stuff that we're talking about. Sheyesh bo bishul achar bishul, but tafshil sheyesh bo marak. He says all this thing that we're talking about of this reheating, that applies to a food, says the Ramah, with marak, with the liquid, the soup in it. Aval davash is bashal kvar, about something which is already cooked, for hu yavesh, and it's dry. In other words, doesn't have a heavy gravy, and we'll see how to define this. Mutter lishroise bechamin b'Shabbos. You can put it in hot water on Shabbos to heat it up. Davar yavesh lo nitbashal milifnei haShabbos, and if it's a dry thing that wasn't cooked before Shabbos, ain't showing us over Chamin Shabbos. You can't leave it in hot water in Shabbos to cook, but you can pour the hot water over it, except for those certain things we just saw from the Mishnah, because those will complete the halachic cooking process. So what we see from here is that according to the way the Shulchan Aruch has presented and the way the Ramah is presented, you can warm up food that is fully cooked, even food that's not 100% cooked, you can also warm up. The only issue is that it has to be what's called yavesh, which is dry. It can't be lach, it can't have marak, it can't have any soup or heavy gravy on it, because that would be problematic. So according to this, for example, let's say you have a rare roast. Can you reheat a rare roast, even though the reheating process may in fact cook the roast to a certain degree? So if it's a roast and it's a dry roast and there's no liquid in it, so then it would seem to be that you can do such a thing. Why? Because it's dry and it doesn't have any of this marak. Okay. Now let's carry on. And because you can eat it, right? Since you can eat it, so therefore it's okay to do such a thing. Okay. The Mishnah Berurah now defines what's this business of marak. Marak. The soup that's got some type of liquid on it. So the Mishnah Berurah says the bedavar lach with something which is it's got liquidy. Kaven the azil chamim usoy v'nitztanein. Why is there a difference between that which is a yavesh, which is dry, and that thing which is not dry? says, because when it comes to this thing with the soup, since that the heat of that soup has disappeared, and it now becomes cold, batal mimeno shem bishulo harishon. The first bishul of that thing, the first name of it being cooked, no longer is this thing. No one can ever confuse a cooked chicken with a non-cooked chicken. A chicken is a chicken, right? That's what it is. You can see whether it's been cooked, whether it hasn't been cooked. But when it comes to water or some type of liquid, if it's cold, who knows whether it's actually been cooked or not? So therefore, the Mishnah Berurah says that with the wet thing, with the liquidy thing, you can't really tell whether it's still got the original cooking space, and so therefore we're no longer allowed to warm that up. Says the Shulchan Aruch in the next siman of the Shulchan Aruch. He says the following. Sorry, the next halacha. He says something's wrong here. Okay, it says there's an opinion. There's something wrong in the Hebrew here. There's an opinion that an issur of bishul will be violated if a baked or roast item is subsequently cooked in a liquid. So we have this idea. There's no bishul there's no bishul achar bishul. There's no cooking after cooking. But is there cooking after roasting, or is there cooking after baking? So there is an opinion that it has to be the same process. So there's no cooking after cooking, but there is cooking after baking, cooking after roasting. And therefore, he says, therefore forbidden to put bread even in a kli sheni that is yad soledes bo. So let's try and understand that. We're looking at a situation where I now have got soup, and I take my boiling hot soup, and I take my boiling hot soup with my ladle. My ladle could either be a kli sheni or it could be the kli rishon if it's been sitting in the pot for too long. But I take my ladle and I take out the soup and I put the soup into, let's assuming it's been in there for a while, so it's actually part of the kli rishon. And I take the ladle, I put that soup into a bowl. The bowl is now the kli sheni. According to this opinion of the Shulchan Aruch, I'm not allowed to take challah. Some people like to take challah, break it up and put it in the soup. I'm not allowed to do that because there is bishul after afia. Afia is baking. So since there's bishul after afia, even in a kli sheni, if it's yad soledet, you're not allowed to do it. However, he says the opinion is that permits it. The Ramah says, what do they permit? The Ramah says they permit it to be placed into a kli sheni. Now, that's a very important principle that we're going to have. Now, I know we've spoken about it before, but it's so important. These things are fundamental. Why is it so important with the kli sheni? Because we have this concept that the kli sheni is enum avasha, that a kli sheni doesn't cook. So if you take your soup and you put it into the kli sheni, and then you put your bread into the soup, so the soup has been cooled down enough that on a halachic level that it can no longer cook the bread. Okay, that's what he wants to say. But then he says there are those who are lenient allowed to be placed even in a kli rishon. So now you've got this machlokes going on, and you can imagine different people have different customs. And you're going to go out for supper, and you're going to get this unbelievable soup, and all you want to do is you want to just take your challah and dip it in the soup and geschmack. You think, oh, what do I do? What am I going to do? Because maybe we don't know what to do. So the accepted custom says the Shulchan Aruch. The accept is what? Says what? The basic custom is that we don't put bread even in kli sheni while it is still yad soledet bo. But all of us have seen people who know halacha, who put their soup, who put their challah or dip it into the soup bowl, right? So how do they do that? So the way we would do it is you'd have to be sure that firstly, it's not an aveira, it's a custom. The custom is not to do it because of the machlokes amongst the Rishonim as to which way to go. So that's number one. But the way to do it is to make sure that when you serve the soup, right, with the ladle, that you don't leave the ladle in the pot. If you take the ladle out of the pot, it's going to cool down enough for it to maintain its status, not as a kli rishon, but as a kli sheni. Okay, and so if it's a kli sheni, then it takes from the kli sheni and puts it into the bowl. The bowl is now kli shlishi, a third vessel, which definitely won't cook. So that is one way of doing it. Other people say, well, we just hold by the opinion of the Ramah, who says that it's okay. Okay, let's continue. Says the Shulchan Aruch. There are certain ways in which to warm up food. Now, I don't want to go into all of those because it's quite complicated on the real technical level, and we'll have to look at it. But on a simple basis, says the Shulchan Aruch says the following: Mutar lanicho keneged hamadura, that it's permitted to put a fully cooked dry food, afilu davash nishbar kol, something which is completely cooked, she'ein bo marak, that you can put it right where, near the fire. Comes along the Ramah and says, va'afilu nitztanein kfar, even if it's cold, you can put it there. Aval im hu roteach, afilu b'yesh bo marak, says now, but if it's liquid is present, it's also allowed to do it if it's cold. Some authorities are lenient. Sorry, there's a bit of a mix up there in the Hebrew language. So I'm just going to go do it in English. Some authorities are lenient and say that even if the food has cooled down, you can put it next to the fire as long as it's not placed above the fire. So therefore, you find that what some people will do is that some people will put it on the side of, if you have a platter or a blech on the stove itself, so you'll put it on the side. You won't put it directly on, because if you put it directly on, that's probably it's directly on the fire. So you'll put it on the side where the fire is, not directly over the fire, because you can't do it above the fire. But the custom, he says here, in this matter is to be lenient as long as it has not completely cooled down. So all of a sudden, the Ramah throws in this concept of reheating food which is liquid as long as it hasn't completely cooled down, which would mean on a certain level that if you had a cup of tea that was not so warm anymore, but it was still hot, it was still warmish, then, and we'll see what that means, right? Then perhaps you can actually reheat it because it has not completely cooled down. And since it's not completely cooled down, it still contains within it the nature of the Bishul Rishon of that first cooking. Okay, so what does it mean completely cooled down? So there's there's always a machlokes, but let's understand. So the Eglei Tal is a sefer on halacha, halachas of Shabbos. It's the primary sefer on halacha. So he says that what does it mean when it's cooled down? It refers to a liquid that is less than yatsoledet bo, but is still sufficiently hot that people regard it as a hot drink. So if it's still warm enough to say, oh, that's a warm drink, that's okay. Okay, so that's already it's got still a little bit of heat in it. The Chazon Ish says that the Ramah is lenient if the liquid's not entirely cooled down. So if it's still slightly warm, you wouldn't call it a hot drink. You'd say it's like, lukewarm. It's like horrible warm. According to that as long as it's still not cold, then still considered to be warm. Now, Rav Soloveitchik explained that the Ramah accepts the strict opinion as normative. The Rav explained that the reasoning of the strict view is that when a liquid cools down, no impact remains from the cooking. So if you remember, we said that you can see when liquid cools down, it doesn't look like it still has that Bishul Rishon. Accordingly, as long as the liquid is not completely cooled down, some of the effect of the original cooking remains, and therefore it's in the state of Bishul, and therefore there's no Bishul achar Bishul, there's no cooking after cooking, and so therefore we can have that. We can use that. Okay. The bigger question in all of these things is, how do you define exactly what a liquid is and what a solid is? Because now we're going to have to start looking at the different achronim. We're going to try and understand what is liquid, what is solid, for us to know what we can and we can't do. So according to the Bach, the Vilna Gaon, and the Mishnah Berurah, food must be free of any liquid to qualify as a solid. have no liquid in whatsoever. Okay, and if it has no liquid in whatsoever, so then it's considered to be a solid. Whereas the Taz, Prima Gadim, the Kaf HaChaim, these are all primary halachic works. It means the Bach, the Vilna Gaon, Mishnah Berurah are primary halachic. The Taz, Prima Gadim, the Kaf HaChaim are also prime. They say the majority of an item is solid. It's classified as a solid, even if it's got a shtickle stuff with it. So therefore, we still hasn't really given a proper definition. So therefore, Rav Yosef Edler was one of the great students of Rav Yosef Dov Soloveitchik. He said that Rav Soloveitchik said if the food is eaten with a fork, it's a solid. If it's eaten with a spoon, it's a liquid. Gamar. So even if you would have a liquidy thing that you would normally eat, with a fork, even though it's liquidy, so therefore it's still considered to be as a solid according to this. Rav Ovadia Yosef goes with us. He says, let's be lenient. But Rav Moshe Feinstein, the absolute preeminent posek of the time, Rav Moshe Feinstein says that you must go strictly. And strictly means that if there's any liquid in it whatsoever, we need to be careful. So the practice would seem to be something which is liquidy, not that you'd eat it with a spoon. But if you would eat it with even if you eat it with a fork, but it's still a liquidy thing, so that would be not appropriate to reheat up, because the liquid in it has that classification of having been cooked already when you warm it up again. Okay, let's look at some of the practical applications. Now, again, it is so vast, all of this, but I just wanted to give a couple of ideas. The first thing is refilling your teacup or your coffee cup. Okay, so why has this become so important? So let's say you just finished your cup of coffee. You really feel like another cup of coffee. Just by the way, there's a big machlokes, which is based on this Bishul achar Bishul, as to whether or not a person, when they make coffee, do you need to put the water in first, which makes the kli a kli sheni, and therefore it will no longer cook, or not? What's that based on? That's based on the question as to whether or not the roasting process, which roasts the coffee beans, is sufficient Bishul to allow you to put it directly or not. The prevailing custom, it would seem to be, is that one should rather fill the cup with water and then put in the instant coffee. There are those who do it the other way around. Whichever one you are accustomed to do is what you should do. What I was taught is put the water in first. Just, it's a doubt why put yourself. It's not the biggest thing in the world. If you're talking about a specific type of connoisseur coffee, maybe it would make a difference if you put the coffee in after you put it in the water. But I think generally, as a rule, we don't worry about that so much. Just don't drink your coffee. I hope I don't get a problem with this, but don't drink your coffee. Rather, just if you have a problem, let me know. I'll sort out the coffee for you. Okay. Anyway, the point is, how do we do it? Okay. So, according to Rav Aaron Kotler, right, if the drops at the bottom of at the bottom of the cup have totally cooled down. So Rav Aaron Kotler says you got to take a tissue, a serviette, and you got to wipe. You actually have to wipe down and dry the cup, because pouring hot water directly, iri kli rishon, onto that cold water, right? Well, now what? Will cook up the water. So many authorities are actually lenient. And why are they lenient? So the Chazon Ish rules leniently. He says you don't have to worry about it. Why is that? And he says because fundamentally there's the concept of ein bishul achar bishul, that there's no bishul after bishul, applies to liquids. Our custom, however, is to say that when it comes to bishul with the davar lach, that there is bishul afterwards. So therefore, number one, it's such a minute amount of water, you don't have to worry. Okay, and Rav Moshe Feinstein expresses it in a much deeper way, and that is that Rav Moshe Feinstein says that there's what we call a sfeik. You have to stand here because I can't see. It's what's called a sfeik. A sfeik means there's a doubt on a doubt. So the first doubt is that And there are many Rishonim, which we saw right at the beginning, that say you can reheat liquids. And since you've got enough Rishonim to say that you can, when it's such a minute amount of water that you don't really need, no one's going to really worry about that. And anyway, why? Because we don't worry about it, it's what we call a psik ratio de lo nechel. It's a psik ratio, which means it's something that's going to happen. De lo nechel, we don't really care about it. Since we don't really care about it, there's a concept of a psik ratio de lo nechel that we're lenient in such situations. So, what, as an example of that, would be if a person knows that they are walking when they walk home on Friday night, they're going to walk past Chaim Cohen's house, and Chaim Cohen's house has got all these sensors. So as you walk past the house, the lights are going to go on. If a person knows that that's going to happen, what do they need to do? Do they need to cross the road? Do they need to go a different way? So on a simple level, and not everybody agrees with what I'm saying, but on a simple level, you don't have to worry about it. Why? Because his lights are not for you. It's a psik ratio. It's definitely going to happen. The lo nechele, it's not for you. And the lights are ready. There's a discussion if that's a derabon and deraisa. So there's so many fakers there as well. So if it's more convenient, if it gives you more oneg to walk on that path, so then you can do that as long as you get no benefit. But if it's like on the corner, right, where it's dark, and you walk past it as psikration, I don't have to, it's not for me, it's for Chaim, but you know that it's going to light up the streets and you'll be able to see properly. So then under those circumstances, you wouldn't be allowed to walk it. So for example, if the street lights are out, then it would be preferable to cross the road because this will give you the light that you need to see under those circumstances. Okay, so when it comes to this, therefore, we see that heating a small amount of water, we can go to a lenient ruling, and the same applies to returning a ladle to a kli rishon. It's the same thing, right? You've got your soup that you've taken off. You have to remember, we've got to take it off the fire. You've got to take it off the out of the crock pot, whatever the case is. You can't. We're going to go to a Haggadah next week. You can't take your cholent out of the crock pot, and we'll understand that. Out of the crock pot while it's still in the heater thing. You've got to take it out. But now you put your ladle into the kli rishon, into the pot, and you take it out, and the soup cools down. Do you now have to wash the soup off? So that's it's so minimal. It's not something that one needs to be concerned about, that there's going to be another bishul of a davar lach in the kli rishon. Okay. So now we spoke about this concept of bishul achar afia, bishul achar, doing all these different things. Cooking after baking and baking after cooking, and then there's roasting. There's all these different things. Now, this is a quote from the Beit Yosef, and the Beit Yosef says the following, and he's quoting from the Ra'am, was Rabbi Avram Yimitz, one of the great Rishonim, and he says the following: Afal gav, even though she'ein bishul achar bishul, even though there isn't normally Bishul, achar Bishul, and he goes through a whole discussion of where it comes out. Okay, he says, nonetheless, we have to be careful. We have to be careful. Why do we have to be careful? He says that because Yizaher Adam, a person has to be careful. Because if we remember that these dinim are dinim d'oraisa, these are Torah prohibitions. And if a Torah prohibition can cause you deep stress, so therefore, what do? You have to be careful. Whilst there are opinions that say it's okay, there are opinions that say it's not okay, and so therefore we have to be careful. And therefore, he says at the end of the day, according to him, that he says, therefore, a person must be careful. Remember, we saw that in the Shulchan Aruch, that a person shouldn't put pat afia, bread that is being baked, even into a kli sheni, Shabbos, in a place where it's hot enough where where it's still quite warm. Adam. You must also be careful when it comes to roasted. A bride meat is not baked meat. It's a different type of thing. Yizahar Adam, basar dag mavusha lo yitain etzel ha'esh b'chum gadol. And meat and fish that has been cooked, you mustn't put close to a fire that's very hot. That'll make it into yatzaledis boy, because then what you're doing is you're cooking with fire, even though it's already been cooked in the oven. It hasn't been cooked over a flame, and cooking over a flame is a different type of cooking from the cooking in the oven. And if you have done, look at these words, chilel es haShabbos, you've been mechal Shabbos, and that if you did it on purpose, then I would suspect that such a person is worthy of being stoned, skila, and he has to bring a korban chatas. So it's quite a big thing, at least according to him. So it's something to bear in mind, that one should be careful. And then he says, he says, you know what? There are certain things that are what we call kale bishul. Kale bishul are things that cook very easily. So what we normally do for us, so many people say, okay, we've got to make tea. So tea is kale bishul. So what we'll do is we'll take the tea, we'll take the hot water, we'll put it into klisheni, put the klisheni into klishlishi, and we'll have it. But he says that we're not bokis, we're not experts in the concept of the kale bishul, of those things which are easily cooked. And since we're not experts in that, we should be very careful to be strict in all of those things. Ad kan l'shona. Those are his words. Those are the words that the Beis Yosef brings down from the Rav Avram Mimitz. And from that, we have to rely on one opinion that says that you can move it into the kli shlishi. The kli shlishi removes it out of a doubt of bishul, and the kli shlishi, according to everybody, for most people, let's say, is okay, in which one can cook in. Okay, so the Shulchan Aruch now expresses that. We don't go into that, and then he says, what this whole idea with the Mishnah Berurah says, "Afilu b'kli sheni b'kli shlishi metzadet ha'prima gadim." He says the Prima Gadim says that you can be makil on it. He's the one single opinion on the Kli Shlishi, which we all rely on when we make tea on Shabbos. One person, the Prima Gadim. But if we didn't have the Prima Gadim, then we would have to rely on the words of the Beis Yosef, which we saw earlier, that when it comes to these things which are easily cooked, we should actually be very strict on everything. Okay, so in the conclusion, so there's a myriad of unresolved disputes. There's so much going on in this Ein Bishul, Acha Bishul. There is Bishul, there isn't Bishul. We saw with liquids, we saw with solids, different types of liquids. But the basic approach of the authorities is to be lenient when a combination of lenient factors exists. And what that gives us is the leniency to say that something which you eat with a fork, even though it may have a certain level of liquidity, for want of a better word, I don't know what the word is, in it, at least according to observation, one would be able to warm up, re-cook, reheat on Shabbos, but one has to decide, is one going to be strict or one is not going to be strict? Those specific things we can discuss, each one on their own merit. So thank you, everybody. It was lovely to see everybody again today. And again, to wish Lionel a long life on the yortzeit of his dad. His God is neshama, should have an aliyah as you either warm things up or refrain from warming things up, reheating, not reheating on Shabbos, making tea in a different way, whatever it is. And when you're going to refill that tea, don't forget that there is a strict approach, but there's also a lenient approach, and you can rely on both and decide what makes your Shabbos experience more ba'onig. Is it taking the strict approach, which is an approach of kedusha, on a higher level, or is it making it less strict so that it's not such a tircha, it's not such a burden on you? Okay, let's stop there and next week. God bless everybody.
Shkar, thank you.
Pleasure,
thank
guys.
you.
Pleasure.
Thank you.